Next episode, we'll be joined by Sean from Northern Ireland and Christian from South Africa and Canada.
That's a lot farther away than Nebraska.
Welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair, a global Witcher podcast. My name is Alyssa from GoodMorhen, and I'll be your host as you, I, and our international hanza accompany Geralt of Rivia and his destiny, Cirilla of Cintra, across the continent. I hope you're all doing well. Since last episode, I've been ambling my way toward a more plant-based diet. I still do eat eggs and cheese for my morning omelets, though, but I am eating a lot more fruits and vegetables. I watched Pride and Prejudice 5 times in 2 days. It was excellent, and I enjoyed it very much. And I had tons of exciting deliveries to my apartment. My little 300 square foot apartment, or 28 square meter apartment, is full with packages of shiny blue bubble mailers, handmade tea towels, a fancy new thermal printer, and I should be getting the new black and speckled chicken enamel pins soon. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, I am a designer by trade, and I love getting to produce goods like this. Sourcing all these materials and seeing these ideas come to life has been another fun little project for me, as if I needed any more. Thanks so much for continuing to support the show so I can continue to create new things for you. I've been so excited to pull together these packages for our patrons, including our producer-level patrons, Louise of Covier, the owner of the Churlish Porpoise, Eric's the Godling, Katie the Redhead of Toussaint, Jacob B., Julie, Sylvia of Skellige, Jameson, Ava of Gullet, Beehaven of the Edge of the World, Jacob Meeks, Sebastian von Novigrad, Charlotte from Mengerberg Glamrai, Red Kite, Louis like Vuitton, the Original Roach, Ariel Kitty, the One True Chef, and Dustin. As producer-level patrons, they receive an introduction shout-out, a spot on the website, bonus content the Saturday after every episode, stickers, an enamel pin set, an exclusive producer gift from partner Emily at Morrison Norris, and producer credits in each and every episode. If you'd like to explore becoming a patron of the show, head over to patreon.com/breakfastinbeauclair. As for this episode, Rob P. from New York and Mitch from Nebraska returned for the second half of episode 103, Betrayer Moon from Netflix's The Witcher. I did take a bit of a backseat in this episode because I was feeling a bit nauseous when we recorded, and I learned a ton from listening to the conversation. Rob and Mitch took the reins for a truly compelling discussion about Geralt and Yennefer's storylines through a filmmaking lens. Join us as Rob and Mitch share their personal interests in filmmaking and screenwriting, followed by an analysis of the unique horror atmosphere and dissection of the climactic transformation scenes of the episode. In our mid-episode news segment, Tidings from Toussaint, Larson Witcherflix shares major news about this week's surprise Netflix announcement, the upcoming spin-off series, The Witcher Blood Origins, as well as additional production news on Season 2. Without further ado, let's get to the discussion for The Witcher Episode 103, Betrayer Moon Part 2. Hey everyone, welcome back from the break. I'm here with Mitch and Rob discussing Betrayer Moon from Season 1 of Netflix's The Witcher. In the first half of the show, we broke down the episode into Geralt's storyline, Yennefer's storyline, and Ciri's storyline, and now we're going to hand it over to Rob and Mitch to actually break down some of their favorite moments from the episode. Before I turn the conversation to The Witcher specifically, Mitch, did you happen to have any questions for Rob? Or Rob, would you have any questions for Mitch?
Yeah, man, what type of genres really speak to you as a writer?
I mean, right now, I obviously really love fantasy. That's typically been my favorite genre. I think it's mainly because it's fantasy can talk about so many issues without it becoming preachy, if you know what I mean. So it's it can talk about so many different issues in such a great way. That's what I really love about it. And it also has so many things that I love, which is monsters and magic and great epic things. Right now, I'm trying to develop a little mini-series right now. Have you guys ever seen Girls?
Yeah.
I haven't watched it, but I'm familiar with it, yeah.
See, I watched all 6 seasons of it. I don't know if I really liked it, but there was something about it that kind of interested me, or else I wouldn't have watched all 6 seasons of it. But
I understand that.
Even though, I don't know if I completely 100% support Lena Dunham or anything, but what I thought was interesting about it was kind of like, like these like unconditional friendships in a way. In the media and in film and television, I always thought it was very interesting how like female friendships are shown versus how male friendships are shown. Because usually in male friendships in TV and in a film, it's about like going out and having a good time. It's never really about like guys opening up to each other or being vulnerable with each other, because that's not traditionally masculine. So I'd love to write stuff that kind of like breaks down those masculinity barriers.
That's great.
So like, yeah, I've been really interested in kind of writing a mini series that's kind of about two roommates who are like friends, and they're like really good friends, and they're really open with each other. And I kind of want to like make a show that breaks those gender barriers of what a male friendship can be. This is why I love The Lord of the Rings. The Frodo and Sam dynamic is not usually what you typically see in a massive multi-million-dollar film conglomerate story, which I really love. I'm really kind of interested in stories like that. I mean, the film I directed not too long ago, it was about like this couple who like become famous online because they just post a picture of an orange online and it becomes famous, and it's ridiculous.
That sounds too real.
Right.
Yeah. As of lately, I've been writing comedic drama stuff, but I'd love to get into more serious things. It's just whenever I start writing something, it somehow ends up being funny, which I don't plan on doing, but it's just kind of what happens.
I mean, that's a skill in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, I have the opposite problem of most people, because a lot of people love to write like dramas and serious things, but for some reason, whenever I start writing, it's like, this would be so funny if I did it this way. So I usually like to go for more comedic effect because it comes more natural to me, and I love doing stuff like that. What sort of things do you like to write, Rob?
I definitely have written a lot of thrillers, a lot of dark comedy stuff. I really like satirical stuff. I mean, that's what my novel is. It's a dark comedy, satirical, like mystery story. I like sci-fi a lot too. I didn't really get into fantasy until I was like 9 or 10 when I started reading the Harry Potter books. I've kind of been on and off fantasy throughout my whole life. I would definitely say sci-fi is probably my favorite genre. Sci-fi and dark comedy. So I tend to write a lot of stuff that has either sci-fi elements or dark comedy elements. Even if it's like a more straightforward, dramatic type story. I always feel like life is not one tone or the other for however long. So you need to have some type of tonal shift or levity. Not only is it a good way to kind of explore the humanity of characters and try and emulate how life is, which I feel like a lot of my writing is very empathetic. And I always want it to be like emotionally honest as possible, no matter the genre. And no matter the characters that I'm writing. So I always try to keep stuff grounded emotionally, but then just allow kind of the story to go in an organic direction and an organic tone, whether it's more comedic or more dramatic.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, because like a great thing about The Witcher is that there are many different types of tones that it brings on and it turns on.
Definitely.
Yeah, so it's like, I really enjoy stories that kind of blend many tones together. And maybe that's why I watched all 6 seasons of Girls, because it was like, at some points it was like really sad and depressing. And at other points it was like, this is kind of funny. I sort of like stories like that, totally.
Yeah, I mean, so now that we've established that Andrzej Sapkowski is really just old Polish Lena Dunham.
Oh my God.
That's what we were going for.
Really, we could just end the podcast here. I think we did all the analysis that we needed to, and that I think this is it.
Here we go, Andrew.
But yeah, I mean, now that the conversation is kind of turning toward The Witcher, could you tell our audience and our friends how you guys got into the universe of The Witcher?
Sure. Mitch, do you want to go first?
Fine. All right. So this is going to be kind of funny, but I didn't know anything about The Witcher until the games. Like a lot of people got introduced through the 3rd game when it came out in 2015, and I watched a playthrough of it from this guy named Chris Smoove, who's actually a basketball game YouTuber, but for some reason he did all of The Witcher 3. It stayed in the back of my mind because I thought it was a really interesting story until I got a PS4 3 years ago, before my freshman year of college, and I bought the game, and I kept it around for like a whole year. And I have no idea why I did that until I finally started playing it and I couldn't put it down. I've played the game 3 times now, which is quite the investment.
Does that include the DLC?
Yeah, that includes the DLC, yes. But then last summer, I saw that the TV show was coming out, and at that point I had watched a playthrough of the first game, and I played the second game. I knew the game story pretty well, but I didn't know too much about the books. I decided to read them over the summer. At first I wanted to watch the TV show fresh, but I ended up not doing that because I just wanted more Witcher stuff. And so I read the books in a very, very short amount of time. And it was also in the summer, so I didn't have much to do. So I think I literally read like all 7 books in like 3 weeks. Yeah, because they really hooked me. I mean, I loved all the characters. It was just so fun to like listen to them and read their dialogue and how unique and introspective they all were. And especially, like, the main character, Geralt, I thought he was so interesting because on the outside, he seems like this titular, badass, masculine hero, but really he's kind of, like, once you break down his outside, he's really not like that at all. He's, like, very philosophical. Mm-hmm. He's kind of a softy lover boy at heart who's thrown in a very dark and sad situation. And he's basically just kind of reacting to the world around him. He's a reflection on the world that he's in. And so really, that's kind of what hooked me about the whole thing. So I just read all of the books and watched the show. Here I am now.
And Rob, you also came into the Witcher universe through the video games as well, right?
I did. So I came in for the Witcher universe through The Witcher 2, Assassin of Kings. So Witcher 2, I got into it through basically playing Mass Effect 3. Once again, I was a big sci-fi fan growing up, so I'd played all the Mass Effect games, and I was really disappointed in how Mass Effect 3 ended. And so I read an interview with the lead designer on Witcher 2, because Witcher 2 was coming out, I think, on the Xbox 360 right after Mass Effect 3 had come out, and they were talking about how in Witcher 2 your choices actually matter and affect the story. So I was like, okay. So Witcher 2 was kind of like my RPG rebound after Mass Effect 3. I really kind of fell in love with the characters and the world. The combat took a little bit getting used to, but once I did, it was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. I kind of waited and anticipated Witcher 3, tried to 100% it as much as I could. Yeah, I played through it 2 times, including the DLC. I really got into Gwent on my second playthrough.
Yep.
Nice.
And then I found out later that Gwent actually is not in the books. It's a game creation, which was so interesting to me.
Well, there is a game that's played by dwarves, and it's called Barrel in the English translation.
Okay.
And it does sound vaguely similar to Gwent.
Is it a dice game? Or
no, it's a card game. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a card game. There's like this whole thing. Geralt notes how beautiful dwarven cards are compared to how shitty and like beer-stained human cards are.
Okay.
And yeah, he talks about how there's a lot of really beautiful efforts into the artwork of dwarven cards. And I always imagine them looking almost like tarot cards. Mm-hmm. For whatever reason when I read that part of the books. But yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. Because unlike Mitch, I have not read the Witcher books. I have skimmed through the plots and kind of the backstories of the characters after beating Witcher 3, just because I was interested in what is the backstory of these characters, because there definitely are things mentioned in Witcher 2 and Witcher 3 and Witcher 1 that call back to events in both the short stories and the novels. Because I didn't know that the games were unofficial sequels. So that's how I kind of found out about the plots and the characters of the actual novels. But I haven't actually read the novels yet. And after watching the first season of the show and really enjoying it, I actually purchased the first 3 books from Barnes & Noble. Like Mitch, I'm going to start reading the books and seeing how the story unfolds for myself finally. And I'm sure that, similar to how the show has made changes from the novels, I'm sure there will be changes that are made when adapting the books to future seasons of the show, which is how it should be. I as someone who is adapted and is actually adapting fiction right now into screenplay form, I think it's important as a writer to not be beholden to the letter of source material, but be beholden to the spirit of it to make sure that it adapts well to the medium that you're making. and if possible, make it even better and stronger. But that's how I got into The Witcher, was through Witcher 2. When I heard about the show and I heard that Henrik's going to be Geralt, I thought that was a great choice. I saw a lot of people on Twitter that were not a fan of his casting because they had only known him for Superman. They thought he was too much of a pretty boy, which is so funny to me because apparently those exact same complaints were brought up by Polish fans when the original Hexer TV adaptation was coming out in the early 2000s. So I thought that was really funny how history was repeating itself. I also did watch the Hexer TV show, and it's exactly what you'd expect from a low-budget, early 2000s Polish production.
It's a spiritual journey.
It's certainly a journey.
Yeah, I've seen clips of the dragon.
Yeah. So that's my experience with The Witcher. You know, having watched season 1, I'm definitely looking forward to seeing where further seasons go.
So the basis of this expert corner that we're going to go over today really does come from the angle of filmmaking and editing. Both Mitch and Rob are going to talk about the episode in this context. Rob specifically, you wanted to discuss the overall atmosphere and mood and how a number of different elements of production ladder up to one specific theme and genre. Would you be able to tell us more about that?
Yeah, sure. So for me, this episode, Betrayer Moon, was my favorite episode of the season because it felt like everyone was firing on all cylinders in terms of not only the writing and the storytelling and the structure, but also the filmmaking craft. Starting all the way from the very first part of the episode where we get this great cold open that just has all this great horror atmosphere in the way that the shots are framed, the way that the pacing gradually reveals new information that kind of builds out the story visually and complements the dialogue that's happening, to the way that, you know, scenes are lit mostly in candlelight for a lot of scenes, or with sunlight or moonlight. All of that, you know, the cinematography and the way shots are framed, a good combination of low angles to get a good sense of foreboding in certain scenes, and then kind of a lot of great wide-angle close-up shots for more impactful, horrific sequences. I think even, you know, not just the action scenes with the Striga fight and Yen's transformation, but I think even with the dialogue scenes themselves, the cinematographer and the director, I think both work in tandem to really create this wonderful horror atmosphere that kind of pervades over the entire episode, because most of the episode takes place at night, and most of the episode revolves around these kind of horrific themes, whether it's a monster that's killing people, or it's a woman who is going through this body horror and the transformation. The filmmaking craft, I think, really complements the storytelling, I think, in this episode really, really well. I think specifically the scene that really stood out to me, other than the opening scene and the Striga fight, is the scene where Geralt and Triss are confronting Foltest and his advisors, and the scene starts with this really grotesque close-up of Foltest eating like a chicken leg, and it's shot in this like wide-angle lens, and he's just kind of framed in the center, and the whole scene kind of revolves around them arguing around Foltest and arguing about what they want to do about the Striga. The whole scene, you know, turns when we get this great close-up of Foltest, who tells them all to like pretty much get the fuck out after Geralt implies that there may have been an incestuous relationship between Foltest and Ada. You know, I just think the way that Geralt and Foltest are framed throughout this beginning part of the sequence, and then the sequence where Geralt confronts Foltest directly after locking the door, I think it's a great back and forth dialogue scene that kind of emphasizes the tension and kind of the horrific undertones of the episode, and just the way that Sean Dooley and Henrik play that scene, and the way that they're both framed, and the way that the pacing of the cuts happens. I think it's just so well done, and I think it tells you so much about their character as well. Not just in the dialogue, but in the performances themselves. It's a really wonderful little scene that then gets further paid off later on when they're friendlier with each other on the bridge. So I just think this episode is just so well done, and I really love everything about it. It reminds me of a really great episode of Game of Thrones too, in the fact that there's such great cross-cutting between Geralt's storyline and Yen's storyline that complements each other and complements the themes of the episode really well. That ultimately leads to the climax of the episode, the action climax and the emotional climax, which is, you know, I think the best fight of the whole season.
I think you picked up a pretty cool point about like the body horror aspect, because yeah, it definitely kind of reminds you of like a Cronenberg movie or a Carpenter movie, especially like Yennefer's transformation. It's pretty gruesome. So yeah, it definitely kind of reminds me of that. Or a De Palma movie. I think Alex Garcia Lopez is probably a huge fan of those directors, if I were to guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of homages to Alien, Jaws, and The Thing.
Yeah.
And The Fly. You don't typically see that in a fantasy TV show. So I thought that was really cool. It wasn't afraid to delve into horror as a genre, and fantasy horror specifically, because that's not something that I think a lot of people expect with a fantasy show is horror. When it comes to, fantasy storytelling, it's usually more character driven. It's usually more sword and sorcery, or it's more political. So I think the fact that the show embraced the horror nature of the short story, and it embraced the horror nature also of, once again, the games, I thought was really great. And I think it kind of made this episode stand out, I think, from the rest of the season. And I think ultimately is part of making The Witcher itself, I think, stand out on its own as a TV show, separated from shows like Game of Thrones and the Shannara Chronicles and Black Sails, shows like that, other fantasy shows, Outlander and the like.
Rob, something that you had brought up in your breakdown of that as well was the juxtaposition of Yennefer and Geralt's storylines. This really comes to a head in the final fight scene as well, and Mitch's final fight scene was one of your favorite moments from the episode. Could you tell us about that?
It was cool. That's all I have to say.
And we're done.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for listening. Stay classy.
Good night, folks.
I think, Robbie, when you mentioned that it is like the action climax, but it also juxtaposes well with like the emotional climax of both characters, of both Yennefer and Geralt. This whole scene starts off with Geralt using Ostrit as bait, essentially, so Geralt can prepare and he can kind of slow down the Striga for a little bit. And then, like, once Geralt leaves, we kind of stay with Ostrit for a bit, and I think this scene is done very, very well. The cutting starts to get really slow. We get these kind of long takes. We get a POV shots. So we're like literally put into Ostrit's perspective. So we're kind of experiencing this moment with him as if we are him.
We get the Alien homage with the umbilical cord falling down from the top of the bed.
Yeah.
It's a really well done sequence.
Yeah, I think it does well of like putting in tension. And it also makes the audience think about, like, the character Ostrit. Like, do we really think that this person should die? Does he deserve to die? There really isn't a right answer to this. Like, we don't know. And, like, a great way to build tension, like, technically, there's a great, like, technique for it called hope plus fear equals tension. If you can put in a small hope that Ostrit may live and get away, and also the fear that he's gonna die, they kind of play with your emotions a little bit. So, like, the monster's gone and he's going to be fine until the monster, like, eats his innards. That is such a gruesome scene because it's like you see his, like, intestines fall out of his stomach and, like, blood splatters on the bed. And it's just so overt. I love it. It's very stylistic, especially for a TV show. Like, I don't see that in a lot of TV shows, especially like monster shows.
If you compare it to something like American Horror Story, right, where it would be way more over the top, even more so than it is in the episode. We would probably see the Striga like rummaging through his like guts and chewing on them. It would be way more gratuitous, I feel like.
Yeah, have you ever seen like Peter Jackson's earlier films, like Bad Taste or something?
Oh yeah, Brain Dead, Bad Taste.
Like, those movies are just so gory, and they're wonderful. Sometimes that's kind of what these scenes remind me of, is these like just over-the-top gory blood fests. It manages to be a little tasteful because it's still like, trying to appeal to a broad audience, so they don't want to go completely over the top. But yeah. So then we transition into the actual fight, and I think both with the pacing and actual structure of the fight, there is kind of an ebb and flow and like a rhythm to the fight, because if it was just like constant action, I feel like people would get bored. Even when there is exciting action going on, there can only be so much of it, or else people will get a little bored of it. I think this is really done well in like the Two Towers. There's like that big battle at Helm's Deep but sometimes they would cut back to the Ents and they talk really slowly, and it's this like juxtaposition of like fast pace versus slow pace. I think they do that pretty well in this fight, because the fight starts off initially with this kind of like Old West standoff in the beginning of the fight scene where Geralt's swinging his silver chain and he throws it down the Striga. You think that he's in power until he's not.
Oh yeah, I was going to say the reveal of the Striga also is just perfect, because it just starts with like this great canted angle of a skull, and like the Striga's in the background, you know, out of frame, and it cuts to like this close up of her like bloody hand after she's kind of slaughtered Ostrid, and then finally we get like a nice close up of her like rotted, twisted, eyeless face, and then like her back as she's like walking down the stairs. It's so well done. The actual reveal of the Striga is so well done.
Yeah, and since this whole scene is in the night, I think it works even better, because it's like, I mean, one, that's a pretty good practical use, because it's like the production team and the art team, they don't have to be as, realistic with it. They can kind of hide her in shadow and bit just to kind of make her even more creepy. I just love it. And like, yeah, these like extra details of her umbilical cord dragging on the floor. It's so creepy. And then like, there's also that added tension of like Geralt actually can't kill the Striga at all, even though he probably easily could since he has this sword, but he never draws it at all. They kind of fight for a bit. I watched this entire scene without any sound to just kind of notice what they were doing with the camera, and it seems like they were primarily focusing on like not complete like camera motion, but just following the action, so it's easy to understand. Like, I know in the first episode the camera movements were a little bit more flashy, but I think in this episode they kind of dialed it down a little bit. It's just so they could like actually follow the action, because it's already really dark, and I feel like if they cut a lot, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. It'd probably be very hard to follow. So I think they did a pretty good job of covering the fight itself.
Yeah, that's what's so great about the sequence, is that it's intercut with Yen's transformation. We see like her being intercut after the Striga tackles Geralt. She breaks from the chain, and Geralt's like, oh, fuck. So we get this like nice little comedic moment. We see Yen's ovaries being removed by the artist. And then we get what I think is the best shot of the whole episode, which is her roaring in pain as we have this like roaring flame in the background, as she just lets out this guttural, visceral scream that immediately then audio bridges a transition back to the fight scene that's handheld, and it's quick and it's intense, right? And Geralt's punching and throwing, the Striga around, and the Striga's throwing him around. Yeah, and then we see him actually use his power for the first time. We see him use the Ard sign. What's so great about that sequence is that it's very intense and very claustrophobic, and then he immediately uses the Ard and sends the Striga flying, and that kind of gives both the characters, like the combatants in the fight, and the audience a bit of like breathing room.
And then he uses Art again to break the floor. They both fall through it. And there's that great shot where the cameraman like literally follows them through the floor.
Yeah, and the behind the scenes.
Yeah, that was great.
Where he's like connected to a rig and he like falls through the floor with them. That was pretty great. I think actually like Yennefer's scene and Geralt's scene are structured similarly, because there is like a very fast, intense moment of the fight, and once they fall through the floor, there's like a breath. And that's the same with Yennefer, because like once her reproductive organs are taken out, there is a little bit of a break when the artist is like matching them together and like making a potion out of it. She gets a little time to breathe as well. Both of those scenes kind of have a rest point until we get into more intense action. I love how they cut together with both the Striga and Yennefer. They both have like these like very profound screams, which I feel like is kind of like a comparison between the two of them. And even like how, Yennefer is losing her ability to give birth, while the Striga is kind of like, in a sense, being reborn as a new person. I think that's pretty powerful. Geralt, later on in the fight, he uses another sign, the Eardan sign, to block the door, and he does a little bit more preparations. The scene sets up the stakes even more by showing that his Witcher potions are broken, so now he doesn't have that safety net that he had beforehand. So now he's just kind of alone, and the Striga kind of escapes his line of sight.
Yeah, we get this great shot where it's a low-angle shot of Geralt looking for the crypt, and we see the Striga has crawled onto the top of the ceiling like a spider, and it's kind of out of focus, and it's just a really well-composed shot. It builds tension really well.
Mm-hmm. Because we as an audience member know that the Striga is above Geralt, but Geralt does not know, so like we're like, Geralt, turn around. She's right there, which is a very great way of building tension. dramatic irony. I think that's what it's called. When the audience knows something but the characters don't. So yeah, as the fight progresses, the fight builds back up in tension. Geralt has that great moment where he puts on the silver knuckles, which I just love. He gets a little bit of his theme playing, punches her in the face. And the music's great in this scene because, like, you know, in Geralt's moments, it's kind of playing his main theme, which is kind of representative of what he does in his main job, but it also transitions beautifully into, like, Yennefer's theme and her forming into a new person. I mean, as Geralt's fight starts, Yennefer's transformation starts. You can literally see her spine reforming. They really pull no punches here. You can really see, like, everything, and it's really grotesque and visceral.
I think Alex Garcia Lopez described it in the behind the scenes of this episode as playing wet. Like, he likes all of his actors and set design to be like, you know, when it calls for it in the scene, he likes everything to have as much, like, physicality to it as possible.
Yeah.
And I think both in the fight with the Striga and then also Yen's transformation, I think that's very much clear.
Yeah, because it's like very dirty things make people uncomfortable, especially when like the characters are just absolutely filthy.
And toward the end of that sequence, we get like a lot of really tight match cuts between Yennefer on the floor and bloodied, as you mentioned, and then also the Striga transformed as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting how, right at the end of the episode, it pretty much ends up with like two like naked women cradled on the floor in completely different conditions, but they're still like both, you know, in pain, and both have gone through a major transition in their life. Both have lost something and both have gained something in a big way.
Yeah, it's a really great linking of both those storylines, I think, thematically, if not so narratively, to kind of really hammer home the themes of this episode. It's a good juxtaposition between one woman, Yennefer, is kind of taking her destiny into her own hands, and the other is someone who, you know, for better or worse, kind of needs a man like Geralt to kind of allow her to have her free will given back to her. And I think it's interesting, at the end, they're both in very vulnerable positions. It's a good visual storytelling in showing that even though these women are different now, they both still have a sense of who they were. What happened to them in their past that led up to their transformations is still with them, and it's still going to be a part of them for the rest of their lives. And especially in Yen's case, the trauma of this transformation sequence ultimately is what defines her character for the rest of the season and her relationship with Geralt. It's an incredible sequence. In my opinion, I think this is the sequence that does intercutting between two sequences and linking them thematically and narratively the best. It's a really, really beautiful and horrific and well acted, well shot, well edited, and well scored sequence.
And I just love the look on Yennefer's face after she's gone through this whole transformation. She's just laying on the ground. She doesn't really look like she's in triumph at all. I've personally had like a couple like major surgeries. When you go through something that is that painful and when you're finally like rid of it, it doesn't really feel like you are like accomplished. It really just feels like, oh my gosh, did that really just happen? She kind of feels like she's in shock of what just happened, and I think it's a great moment.
Yeah, you can tell that she's processing the trauma of the experience for sure.
Yeah, it's great. I would also like to mention how like tasteful all the nudity has been in this show, because I feel like even in like shows like 5 years ago, like nudity, especially towards women, can be like very gazy. I don't really think that this show does that. So,
well, I think you can tell that a female showrunner is behind this show in the way that female characters and female emotions and female sensibilities are really portrayed. I don't know if a male showrunner was behind this show, if we would even have scenes of Yennefer's backstory in it, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I think that's the best adaptation choice that I think Lauren Hissrich and her writing team made in adapting The Witcher, is that they really focused not just on Geralt in the way that Sapkowski did. They really focus on Yennefer and Ciri as characters and developing them as characters, so that when they are together as characters by the end of the season and presumably at the beginning of the second season, we really, you know, have come to know them as people. And I think this episode absolutely justifies those adaptation choices for sure.
I think that was a very interesting point about how you said like a male showrunner probably wouldn't have gone to her backstory, because I feel like a male showrunner definitely would have like appealed to Yennefer's more mysterious side. They probably would have loved to like show off her like mysterious character, but I feel like Lauren Hissrich, I feel like she did a really good job of like making Yennefer more than just a mysterious sorceress, really. showing her vulnerability, showing her past. It's great.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I like this interpretation of Yen more so than in Witcher 3, which is how I was first introduced to the character. Like I said, I haven't read the interpretation of her in the books, so I'm interested in seeing how she's portrayed in the show compares to the books as well.
Yeah, and that would be the perfect opportunity to talk about some of the differences and comparisons between Sapkowski's work, the script, and then how it ended up ultimately on screen. Before we get to the changes between the books and the television adaptation, we're going to hand it over to Lars from Witcherflix for recent news on the Netflix show. When we come back, Rob, Mitch, and I will continue our discussion of Betrayer Moon.
Hey, it's Lars from Witcherflix, and this is Tidings from Toussaint. Welcome back, everybody. Wow, this was surprising and came kind of out of nowhere. There will be another Witcher show on Netflix. We already knew about the animated movie Nightmare of the Wolf, which is about Vesemir, but the new show, called The Witcher Blood Origin, will make the Witcher world even bigger. Let's see what it's all about. On Twitter, Netflix wrote, 1,200 years before Geralt of Rivia, the worlds of monsters, men, and elves merged into one, and the first Witcher came to be. Announcing The Witcher Blood Origin, a 6-part live-action The Witcher spin-off series from Declan de Barra and Lauren Schmidt-Hissrich. As you can see, Blood Origin will be a prequel spin-off show consisting of 6 episodes that is set way before the events of the main show. Blood Origin's showrunner Declan de Barra is well known if you followed The Witcher on Netflix. The Irish TV writer had not only written the main show's episode of Banquets, Bastards and Burials, this is the one with Dooney and Pavetta, he also wrote and sung on one of the soundtrack's most iconic songs, the Song of the White Wolf. This is what Declan had to say about his new series. As a lifelong fan of fantasy, I am beyond excited to tell the story The Witcher Blood Origin. A question has been burning in my mind ever since I first read the Witcher books. What was the elven world really like before the cataclysmic arrival of the humans? I've always been fascinated by the rise and fall of civilizations, how science, discovery and culture flourish right before that fall. How vast swathes of knowledge are lost forever in such a short time, often compounded by colonization and a rewriting of history, leaving only fragments of a civilization's true story behind. The Witcher Blood Origin will tell the tale of the elven civilization before its fall, and most importantly, reveal the forgotten history of the very first Witcher. Even Andrzej Sapkowski, Witcher author and creative consultant on Blood Origin, commented on the new show. He said, "It's wonderful how, as in the original plan, the world of The Witcher is growing bigger." Other people involved include Jason Brown and Sean Daniel from Hive Mind, and Tomek Baginski and Jarek Zafko from Platique Films. Beside Declan de Barra and Lauren Hissrich, they will all serve as executive producers. Moreover, Netflix said the show will be shot in the UK, but we do not know yet when it will be released. Similarly to the shooting schedule on the main Witcher show, it is likely that Blood Origin could see a release date in 2022. But now back to season 2 of the main show. Redanian Intelligence reported that the pre-production for the restart of the filming process has already begun. This also includes actors like Henry Cavill and Freya Allen. The filming will continue on August 17. According to Redanian Intelligence, the filming for season 2 is currently planned to last until February of 2021. This extended filming schedule is of course the result of the necessary precautions due to the coronavirus, among other factors. In other news, we now know what special effects studios will work on season 2. Platique Image, Cinesight, One of Us and Clear Angle Studios have already worked on season 1 and they will return. Moreover, 2 big names have joined them. First, the Third Floor, known for their work on big movies like Rogue One or Spider-Man Far From Home, will work on season 2 of The Witcher. According to Redanian Intelligence, one of the most famous and largest visual effects studios of the world has also joined the team. Industrial Light and Magic will work on season 2. The studio was founded by George Lucas in 1975 and has since then worked on classic movie franchises like Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Jurassic Park or Harry Potter. Wow, so many good news to report today. Lots of awesome things to look forward to in the realm of The Witcher. Anyway guys, that's it for me for today. I hope you all stay safe and well. We'll talk again in the next episode of Breakfast in Beauclair. Until then, thanks again for listening and good luck on the path.
Hey everyone, welcome back from the break. I'm here with Rob and Mitch discussing Betrayer Moon from season 1 of Netflix's The Witcher. When we left off, we had discussed the horror atmosphere of the episode and the climactic transformation scenes. We'll jump into the differences between the books and the show. I think that there are 4 really defining points that are differences between the books and the show. The first is how common knowledge the relationship between Folsist and Ada is, the inclusion of Triss Marigold as the second, the relationship between Fringilla and Yennefer as the third, and then the last difference would be Yennefer's infertility and the origins of it. The first difference that we have is the relationship between Folsist and Ada. That relationship is still the same in the books, but the difference is how common the knowledge that they were in a relationship is. There's not really any shame about the relationship as well. Like, Folsist is very forward. He's actually the one that is looking for people to cure the Striga. So it's not that he's kind of hiding that the Striga is his daughter. Everybody knows it, and he's specifically calling people to the kingdom. So it's not that Geralt is hearing about it from word of mouth. He picks up one of Foltest's proclamations and then goes in search of this reward.
Yeah, and Foltest, I wouldn't say he's completely different, but he's definitely changed up quite a bit from the book than he is in this show. Because, like, in the book, he's younger. Sapkowski actually points out that he's a pretty guy. He's actually very good looking, maybe even too good looking.
And Foltest is in the beginning of Witcher 2.
Yes.
And he is definitely portrayed as younger in that game as well than he is in the show, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting that they did cast an older actor for the show. I think, having not read the book, I still think Sean Dooley, did a really good job interpreting the character. I think that is interesting, though, that he is much younger. And I wonder if they made that choice, maybe you guys can comment on this more, but I wonder if they made that choice because they wanted to have the juxtaposition of how much time is in between Geralt's storyline and the Yennefer storyline. Maybe that's why they decided to cast an older actor to kind of make it more apparent that a lot of time has passed between the two storylines.
One of the major things to note is that the story The Witcher came out in 1986, and it was meant to be a standalone short story for that contest in Fantastica. So there's some weird little storytelling things that kind of happen, but there was presumably no additional backstory to any of these characters other than what we were told immediately. We do hear in the original text that Foltest is meant to be younger than 40. I think it's a pretty plausible theory that they might have just aged him up in order to, show the difference between Yennefer and Geralt's timelines.
Yeah, and I feel like the purpose that The Witcher short story and this episode, they have to serve completely different purposes, because for a lot of people, The Witcher is the very first thing that they read in the entire Witcher saga. Not only does it have to tell this story, but it also has to introduce Geralt as a character. It has to introduce the world. It has to introduce so many things, aspects of the entire world, and this episode doesn't have to do that. So it can play around with the plot more, because in the book, everything is pretty much just revealed to Geralt at once. He doesn't really have to do any investigating. He pretty much already knows how to lift the curse. Mm-hmm. While in the episode, he and Triss have to investigate. It is kind of like a Scooby-Doo episode where they have to take out clues and Geralt has to figure out how to lift the curse, even if it is a curse. At first, they don't even think it is a Striga, it's a Vukudlak.
Yeah. And that is a really nice segue into the discussion of why Triss might be in the episode at all. She does serve as kind of a guide for Geralt while he's in Temeria, but also ultimately we're introduced to her character much earlier than we could have been. As an audience, we get investment into Triss before she has importance in later episodes.
Yeah, because not to get into any spoilers, but in later books, when Geralt and Triss see each other, they imply that they have a history, and I feel like they wanted to show that they had a history rather than tell us that they had a history. So I feel like they definitely wanted to include Triss in one of Geralt's adventures. Since Triss is in Temeria and this story takes place in Temeria, I feel like they felt like this was a very opportune point to put her in the story.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember, does Triss ever become a advisor to Foltest in the books or the games?
Yes, she is.
Yeah. I think she's natively from Temeria as well, and she is an advisor to Foltest.
Okay. That would make sense then why they would push up that reveal to now to kind of establish that earlier, like you said, Alyssa. Because Triss is certainly a more important character in the games, I feel like, than she is in the books, even from the limited knowledge that I know. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's interesting that they're kind of trying to, like you said, establish her earlier on in the show to kind of get people who not only are more familiar with the games, maybe a little bit more invested, but to also, in a way, set her up for future seasons and future episodes of the show where her character becomes prominent and her relationship with Yennefer and Geralt becomes more prominent. And I think the actress, Anna Schaefer, she brings a real sense of, I guess, like, humanness and, like, I'm trying to find the right word, but I think she does a really good sense of, like, the calming influence of Triss, while also having a little bit of feistiness as well. I think she does a really good job of portraying the character in this episode.
Yeah, I think it's always been like a trademark for Triss that she's usually a little bit more emotionally available than all the other sorceresses. Yeah.
You know, despite the differences with both Triss and Folsist, their characters in the show are, like, very much self-contained. Like, if you don't have the comparison to the books, they still work within the context and the fiction of the show, which is nice.
Yeah, and like I said, I haven't read the short stories, so for me, yeah, it made total sense. Like, oh, he's a king, Triss is his sorceress advisor. I was like, okay, cool. This is her, like, cool little introduction where she uses her powers to kind of rope Geralt into helping her and helping Temeria.
Mm-hmm. And Triss does also serve a pretty good function for the end of the episode, because in The Last Wish, when Geralt gets injured by the Striga, he has to, like, heal up at the Temple of Meledoli for, like, literally the rest of the book. And Triss is able to heal him right there and then so he can, like, continue on his journey. That was a good way of using her character to save Geralt there.
Yeah, because we don't have the character of Valorad, the Castellan of Vizima, here, but Triss kind of takes over that role, so there is some consolidation of characters along the way.
Yeah.
But going back to, let's say, her placement in Foltest's court, we learn about the origins of why that is because we see that happen with Yennefer and Fringilla in Yennefer's storyline. So we hear how those decisions are made amongst the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, between influential sorcerers on the continent, including Tissaia de Vries, Stregobor from Banard, and Fringilla's uncle, for example. One of the key differences in this whole series is that, you know, without spoilers, in the books, Fringilla and Yennefer don't really have an existing relationship, such as being classmates. Nilfgaard in the books is very much separated from the events of the Northern Kingdoms, like including jurisdiction under this Brotherhood of Sorcerers. So in the books, I would argue that, like, the chapter wouldn't have had the power to place anyone in Nilfgaard in this way. But again, like, because of the fiction that they're creating around the version of the continent that's in the show, it still works. So I think it's fine that it happens that way, but, like, in the books, they just don't have an existing relationship.
And I think it makes sense in a show to create that relationship because then it creates more tension and conflict later on between those two characters, whereas if that relationship wasn't there, there wouldn't really be any emotional conflict or tension later on when those two characters come to interact with each other. So I think that was a smart choice to kind of have these characters in this space, and while you're also developing Yen's backstory, you're developing Fringilla's backstory as well, and their interactions together. And not to spoil later episodes, but there will be stuff that's set up in this episode that's paid off in future episodes.
Yeah, seeing them in the exact same origin gives you a baseline to see how far they diverge in the rest of the season. The last comparison to the books would be about Yennefer's infertility and the infertility of sorcerers on the continent as a whole. And in the books, there's really no clear reason for infertility in sorcerers that's defined. We learn in A Question of Price and Something More that sorcerers as well as witchers can't have children. And we learn in The Bounds of Reason and Something More that Yennefer's infertility is an upsetting character trait for her. But the decision to remove her reproductive organs was something that's original to the show. In the books, it's not necessarily that she doesn't have them. It could also be that for whatever reason, their longevity prevents it, their use of magic might prevent it. We don't really get that life force in exchange for magic, which is on brand for Sapkowski because he kind of like half makes up things and then they're just not really explained. So it makes sense that like the show would have to kind of explain the physics and metaphysics of the world.
Yeah, I'm assuming if somebody asked him specifically, like, why can't Yennefer have children? He'd probably be like, she can't have children. That's it.
And yeah, like that would kind of be that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I haven't read the books, but I will say from the limited knowledge and the limited passages of the books that I've read and episodes of the podcast that I've listened to that you've done, Alyssa, I feel like the show treats its female characters a lot better in some ways than Sapkowski does. Just because a lot of the portrayals of women are framed only through Geralt's kind of male gaze, whereas in the show you can tell that it's being framed through a female gaze, through Lauren's gaze. Once again, not to spoil future episodes, but I think the adaptation choices they make for some of the female characters later on in the season, I think are more interesting and kind of give some of the female characters later on in the story more depth and dimension.
Mm-hmm. And we're really going to see, I think, the agency of different females a lot in the next episode of Banquets, Bastards, and Burials when we get to see all different sorts of women in power. Let me put it that way.
Absolutely. I feel like this episode is a great template for what this show could be when it's firing on all cylinders. I hope that for season 2 that every single episode of it can be as strong as this episode. I want to give props to everyone that was involved in this episode and its creation. Everyone did a really fantastic job, from the director and the writer to the cast and crew. I felt they all did a really fantastic job.
Yeah, this was a very well made episode. Like, I've read a lot of reviews and stuff, and a lot of people say once they watched this episode, they were pretty much hooked on the show, which makes me really happy because I feel like in my friend group specifically, I feel like I've been alone in my Witcher fandom, but I've really loved this, seeing these stories go more into the public limelight and more of a mainstream story. And I think that's great because I just think it's such a great story.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful that we were able to take a look at such an important key episode, especially through the lens of editing and how these stories come together in order to create something that is engaging and that really creates something new for the audience. So that is it for our show today. Mitch, Rob, thank you so much for joining us for this episode, and thank you to our Hanza for listening. So where can people find you? And is there anything that our community can help you with, or anything that you'd like to share with them?
You can find me on YouTube, and this is an old username that I haven't changed, so please don't laugh, listeners, but it's youtube.com/JediFan421.
Nice.
We're into it.
That's where I have a lot of edited videos. I actually have a video uploaded that basically takes scenes from the first season of The Witcher and edits them in a similar style to The Witcher 3. So that is up on my YouTube channel. It's called Netflix's The Witcher, but it's The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. So yeah, you can check that out. And you can check out my Twitter for leftist political retweets and thoughts and occasional musings on entertainment and pop culture like The Witcher. And that is at Dr. Pigott. That's DOCTORPIGOTT.
Well, currently right now, you can find me, if you liked listening to me in this podcast form, I am on another podcast called Lights, Camera, Roll, which is a D&D podcast, and I am one of the characters in it. So if you want to listen to me on that, it's Lights, Camera, Roll. We're on Spotify, we're also on YouTube, and I think we're on Apple Podcasts and all that. Any of your podcast platforms. You can also follow me on Twitter, also for leftist political musings and random entertainment rants. Usually me just complaining about raging against the machine or something, but that is at Mitch Fay, MITCHFEY. That's my info.
Thanks for having us, Alyssa.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. This has been incredibly insightful into the world of editing. So thank you guys so much for bringing your expertise to this episode. Next episode, we'll be joined by Sean from Northern Ireland and Christian from South Africa and Canada to discuss Geralt's destined surprise in our coverage of episode 4 of Banquets, Bastards, and Burials. Thanks for joining us at the breakfast table. For show notes, transcripts of each episode, and complete list of our social platforms and listening services, head over to breakfastandbeauclair.com. Breakfast and Beauclair is created by Alyssa from GoodMorhen. It's hosted by Alyssa with the Times Produce News second by Alyssa and Flicks. The show is edited by Alyssa with the Breakfast and Beauclair theme by Mitchell Filter Media and the Times Produce theme by Bettina Campamanas. Breakfast and Beauclair is produced by Alyssa in New York City with Louise of Covier, the owner of the Churlish Porpoise, Eric Scodling, Katie the Redhead Produce, Jacob B., Julie, Sylvia Skellige, Jameson, Ava of Gullet, D. Haven at the Edge of the World, Jacob Meeks, Sebastian von Novigrad, Charlotte Megberg Glamour, Red Kite, Louis Lake Vuitton, the Original Roach, Ariel Kitty, the One True Chef, and Dustin. Special thanks to Rob P. and Mitch for joining us for this episode, and our international Hanza for their support.